She returned in disgrace, soaked by the rain, stripped of dignity, betrayed by a love she had trusted. In a mansion that never forgave scandal, a father's cold judgment forced her into a marriage she did not choose, to a man who could neither read nor write. But beneath the silence of their vows lay secrets waiting to be revealed, a past demanding justice, and a love powerful enough to rewrite destiny itself. Duty or desire, silence or truth, which would you choose? Welcome, dear listener. Tell us, where in the world are you joining us from, and what is it about historical romances that captures your heart? Boston, Massachusetts, autumn of the year 1880. The leaves had begun their descent in solemn spirals, painting the cobblestone streets in rust and gold, as if mourning what could never return. The Hale residence on Beacon Hill stood in stern silence, a pillar of wealth and decorum, whose windows did not open for scandal, nor shutters tremble for sorrow. It was within these walls, gilded with restraint and ruled by the iron will of Charles Hale, that the downfall of Isadora Hale unfolded like a broken aria. She returned on a rain-washed morning. No carriage, no escort, no gloves. Only the whisper of her worn boots across the marble floor and the rasp of her breath, short and uneven beneath a cloak soaked through. Her hair, once arranged with precision and pearl combs, hung damp against her cheeks, the auburn strands darkened by shame and drizzle. Her eyes, those once bright grey-blue mirrors of breeding and wit, were dulled now by something far heavier than weather. Julian Gray was gone. She had left with him 3 nights before, draped in midnight silk and reckless hope, into the arms of a man who had murmured promises of New York steamships and silver-ringed freedom. She had believed him, and now she returned alone. Her satchel had been cut from her shoulder, her brooch was missing, and the bruises on her wrist, though fading, spoke the kind of truth society never forgives. Charles Hale stood in the foyer, flanked by marble busts and the weight of his ancestors. He did not rage, he did not raise his voice. His silence was colder than winter tide, and when he spoke, it was with a stillness that carved through flesh. "You will marry him," he said, his voice echoing against the walls like judgment itself. She did not ask who. Somewhere deep in the hollow of her chest, she already knew. Later that same day, Isadora was dressed not in white but in grey, a dress of mourning lace, neither bridal nor funereal, an echo of both. Her corset pinched tighter than any hand ever had. Her lips were bloodless, her gaze unblinking. The chapel was not the family's, but a modest parish near the docks. Its pews smelled of salt and cedar. No flowers adorned the altar. No music drifted through the nave. The only attendees were a priest with shaking hands, 2 stone-faced servants, and the groom who stood at the front. Not a man she knew, but a man her father owned. Thomas Flynn wore no cravat. His boots were scuffed. His shirt, though clean, bore the faintest trace of soot near the cuffs. He was taller than she remembered, taller than most men, and his silence carried the weight of someone who had long ago accepted the cruelty of this world. His dark hair was brushed neatly, but it did not belong to silk pillows or perfume ballrooms, and his hands, clasped in front of him, bore the scars of 1,000 unspoken days. When he lifted his gaze to hers, he did not smile, he did not flinch, he only looked. And in that single moment, brief as breath, Isadora felt the strangest thing, not humiliation, not fury, but the first flicker of disquieting calm, as though, within the storm of her disgrace, he were the only soul who did not see her as ruined. The priest mumbled the rites. Isadora repeated her vows with lips that barely moved. Thomas's voice was low, almost hoarse, but he spoke each word clearly, without shame or stutter. They left the chapel as man and wife. No rice, no carriage, only whispers. At the threshold of the Flynn home, modest, brick quiet, Thomas opened the door for her without a word. Inside, the scent of warm bread mingled with wood smoke. A woman's voice called from the kitchen, Margaret Flynn, his mother, unaware that her household had just doubled in size. Isadora stood motionless in the parlor, surrounded by furniture not meant to impress, but to last. She heard the creak of stairs, the distant clang of a kettle, the hush of unfamiliarity pressing in. Thomas returned with a towel and held it out to her. She hesitated. Then, as her fingers brushed his, rough, warm, undeniably real, something shifted. It was not affection, nor forgiveness. It was the first breath after drowning. That night, as she sat before a small fire in a borrowed nightgown, Isadora did not cry. She did not scream. She watched the flames dance and listened to the quiet movements of the man she had been forced to marry. The man who, from the other side of the room, tended to the fire without speaking a word. And in the hush of that strange new silence, she realized something more terrifying than disgrace. She was not alone, and he was watching her, not like a master, not like a jailer, but like a man who had no idea what to say to a woman broken by the world, only that he would not be the one to break her further. The attic room was still and quiet, as though the air itself dared not disturb the fragile line that had been drawn between husband and wife. The walls were slanted and low, wrapped in a thin layer of plaster that carried the scent of old wood and lavender soap. A single oil lamp glowed on a narrow table by the window, its flame trembling against the glass with every breath of wind from the November night. Isadora stood by the door, frozen in place, her spine stiff beneath the coarse cotton of her borrowed nightdress. It was a modest thing, loose at the sleeves, buttoned to the throat, worn thin at the hem from years of washing, but to her it felt more intimate than a corset unlaced. She had never slept in a stranger's home, and certainly not beside a man she had been married to for less than a day. Her fingers curled tightly around the handle of her small valise, though there was little inside it. A change of underclothes, a worn hairbrush, the silver crucifix that had once belonged to her mother, now wrapped in linen at the bottom of the bag, like a relic no one was allowed to see. She held it not for protection, but for memory. Thomas was at the far end of the room, near the fireplace, his back to her as he tended to the low-burning embers. His movements were slow, measured, unintrusive. He added a single log and adjusted the iron grate, careful not to let it clatter. Then he stood, brushing his hands absently against his trousers, and turned to face her. She expected command. She expected discomfort. She expected that silence would be a weapon, just as it had been in her father's house. But what she received was something wholly unexpected: restraint. "I sleep by the hearth," he said, voice roughened by disuse, but not unkind. "There's clean linen on the bed. If it gets too cold, the quilts are thick." He did not step closer. He did not lower his eyes to her figure or glance at her face in disdain. He simply spoke, then waited, as if giving her the option to decline his presence altogether. Isadora felt a tremor build just beneath her skin, not from fear, but from something she could not yet name. She looked at him fully for the first time. The light from the fire caught the edge of his face, high cheekbones, a jaw marked by the faintest hint of stubble, and eyes that reflected not judgment but something quieter, perhaps patience, perhaps distance, perhaps both. He crossed the room slowly, not toward her, but toward the stack of folded blankets resting on the chair by the door. He lifted one, held it out to her. "For your feet," he murmured. "It gets colder up here than it should." She hesitated. Then, without speaking, she released the valise from her grip and took the blanket from his hands. Their fingers brushed, brief, accidental, and that one point of contact sent a jolt through her chest that startled her more than any harsh word ever could. His hands were warm, rough, yes, calloused by labor, yes, but warm. He returned to the fire and sank down onto the small cot beside it. The mattress creaked faintly beneath his weight. He didn't look at her again. Instead, He unlaced his boots slowly, as though this were just another night in a life filled with long days and quiet evenings, as though the woman standing across from him, tense and trembling, were not a stranger bound to him by paper and pressure. Isadora exhaled quietly as she turned to the bed. It was small, built for one. The linen smelled faintly of rosemary and starch. She placed the blanket at the foot and slid beneath the covers with mechanical grace, never allowing her back to face the room. The mattress gave slightly beneath her, adjusting to her unfamiliar weight. She folded her hands over her stomach, eyes fixed on the dark ceiling beams above, every sense tuned to the softest creak, the gentlest shift of the man across the room. But he did not move. The silence between them deepened, not heavy, not hostile, but dense, like snow falling in the night. She could hear the faint breath of wind pressing against the window panes and the occasional pop from the firewood below. And beneath it all, his breathing, slow, even, human. She turned her head, just enough to see him. Thomas sat hunched forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely before him. He was staring into the fire, face unreadable, as though there was something in the flames only he could see. His shoulders, broad beneath the simple linen shirt, rose and fell with calm purpose. There was no tension in him, no urgency, only quiet control. "Why don't you speak more?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He looked over, meeting her gaze across the distance with surprising ease. "Words take space," he said. "I leave that space for people who need it more than I do." His answer was not evasive. It was honest. Brutally, gently honest. Isadora turned her eyes back to the ceiling, unsure whether the ache in her throat was from exhaustion or from the way his words had landed, softly, unexpectedly, beneath her ribs. "I'm not what you expected," she whispered. He did not answer right away. Then, quietly, "No." A pause. "But I never expected much from the kind of man who accepts a wife from a man like Charles Hale." Her heart stopped. The air grew still. She turned again, this time fully. "Then why did you say yes?" Thomas shifted slightly. His gaze remained on the fire. "I didn't say yes for you," he said after a moment. "I said yes for her." Her brow furrowed. "Your mother?" He nodded. "She said no woman deserves to be thrown away like livestock, not even one who walks like she's above the rest of us." The words should have cut, but they didn't, because they were true, because he had seen her, fully, without cruelty, without flattery. She sat up slowly, clutching the blanket to her chest. The firelight danced across her features, softening the sharp angles of her face, casting her in bronze and shadow. "I'm not proud of what I did," she murmured, "but I'm not sorry I left." "I didn't ask you to be," he said simply. Another silence, but this one was warmer. Thomas stood, and for a moment she tensed, uncertain. But he only crossed to the small window, turned the latch, and adjusted the frame until the wind stopped whistling through the seam. He returned to his cot and sat again, this time laying back onto the thin pillow. His profile was peaceful, rugged, handsome in a way that made her breath catch, though she would never admit it aloud. Not yet. As she settled once more beneath the quilt, something shifted inside her. A knot of dread, long nestled beneath her sternum, began to unravel, slowly, thread by thread. Just before her eyes drifted closed, she heard him speak, low, barely above a whisper. "I won't hurt you." The words hovered in the air like a promise, spoken not from duty, but from something far older, something sacred. She did not reply. She did not need to. That night, for the first time in weeks, Isadora Hale slept without fear. The morning air tasted of iron and coal, thick with the breath of a city that never truly slept. Boston, in the cold light of late autumn, wore no adornments. Its beauty was buried beneath smokestacks and factory whistles, hidden in the rhythm of laboring bodies and horse-drawn carts, in the soft wear of boots against cobblestone, in the breath that turned to fog with every exhale. Isadora awoke to the sound of Margaret Flynn humming softly downstairs, her voice cracked by time but still touched with warmth. The melody was unfamiliar, something Irish no doubt, and carried a weight of memory that Isadora could only guess at. The room was dim, the pale grey light slipping between the wooden slats of the attic window. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from a night of unbroken stillness, her hands curled around the wool blanket still drawn over her legs. She had not dreamed, or if she had forgotten, and perhaps that was a mercy. The air in the attic room was colder than before. She crossed to the small wash basin in the corner and dipped her fingers into the frigid water. She tied her hair herself, loose, imperfect, with strands falling down her neck, and dressed in one of the plain cotton day dresses Margaret had lent her. It was burgundy, with a modest collar and a faint tear near the hem. Not silk, not velvet, but warm. When she descended the stairs, the scent of baking bread greeted her, stronger than perfume, more comforting than memory. Margaret stood near the hearth, sleeves rolled, hands dusted in flour. Her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when she looked up. "Did you sleep, dear?" Isadora hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, thank you." Thomas was not in the room. His absence was a weight she didn't fully understand. Margaret handed her a small plate. "Toast what's left of the dough, will you? Fire's still strong." Isadora took the dough. Her hands, once used only to holding books and embroidery needles, felt clumsy with it. She pressed it too flat. It tore. She tried again and again. The third time, it held. "You'll learn," Margaret said, not unkindly. "Burned bread still fills the belly." That morning, Isadora swept the kitchen floor. She folded linen stiff with wind. She attempted to polish the oil lamp, but spilled a portion of the kerosene and flushed with shame. Margaret simply offered her another rag and continued humming. Later that day, Thomas returned, his boots carrying dust and something else, tension. "There's been a shortage," he muttered. "Some of the looms are down." Margaret frowned. "You'll eat first." "I can't stay long." Their exchange was brief, familiar, but before he turned to go, Thomas looked at Isadora. Not long, just long enough to speak, without speaking. She followed him. The factory was less than a quarter-mile from their home, tucked between two warehouses and overshadowed by a looming smokestack that had blackened the nearby buildings into submission. The walls were brick, the windows high and grimy. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and something acrid Isadora couldn't place. Inside, the world changed. The noise struck first, a cacophony of pulleys, clattering looms, shouts swallowed by machinery. Men and women moved like parts of a machine themselves, each step measured, each hand assigned. Children darted between spools and belts with practiced speed, too small to be noticed by the world, too important to be dismissed by it. Isadora stepped closer to Thomas instinctively. He didn't take her hand, but his presence at her side felt like a barrier between her and the chaos. "This is where I work," he said, "where your father's empire breathes." She looked at him, then at the factory. "This is not breathing. This is surviving." He did not argue. They passed a boy no older than 9, sitting near a pile of discarded threads. His skin was pale beneath the grime. His lips were chapped, and when he coughed, it was sharp, wet, and tinged with red. Isadora stopped. "He's bleeding." Thomas looked at the boy, then back at her. "He'll be gone by week's end." "You mean dismissed?" He met her gaze, eyes unmoving. "I mean buried." Her breath caught. "And nothing is done." "There's always another boy waiting," he said. "Your father made certain of that." She looked back at the child. His eyes had closed. A girl nudged him with her foot. He didn't stir. Thomas placed a hand on her shoulder. It was the first time he had touched her in daylight. "Don't look too long," he said. "You'll start to see everything." That night, Isadora could not eat. She sat on the edge of the bed in the attic room. her fingers running across the seam of her skirt. Her thoughts churned, refusing sleep. Around her the house exhaled its old sounds, floorboards groaning, wind tapping the window panes, fire sighing in the hearth below. Something pressed at her, restlessness, a yearning for clarity. She crossed the room and approached the small writing desk tucked into the corner, where Margaret kept her letters and prayer cards. It was old, with a single locked drawer. The key sat in plain view atop the shelf. She hesitated, then turned it. Inside were few belongings, a worn photograph with frayed edges, a single silver medallion on a dark velvet ribbon, and a folded letter yellowed with time. She held the photograph beneath the lamplight. A man stared back, tall, square-jawed, with the same green eyes she had begun to recognize. His uniform was that of a mill supervisor, perhaps 15 years younger than Thomas was now. He stood beside a loom, one hand resting on the frame, the other clenched at his side. Pride burned behind his stillness. The medallion was heavier than it appeared. She ran her thumb across the engraving. To Michael Flynn, for service above duty. She turned the letter over. The name was smudged. The date read November 1867. She did not read it. She did not need to. When she returned the items, she folded the photograph more gently than she had found it. She locked the drawer again, slid the key back into place, and returned to bed. But she did not sleep. Because now there was a silence between them, no longer built from unfamiliarity, but from a secret. And it was not the kind of secret that begged to be uncovered. It was the kind that waited and watched and guarded the quiet heart of a man who spoke little, but had once, it seemed, loved with everything he had. The days had grown shorter. Boston was cloaked in a curtain of grey that hung low over rooftops and chimneys, dimming the sun before it had a chance to rise. Each dawn seemed to arrive reluctantly, its light more suggestion than substance. The mornings were colder now, the kind of chill that crept through brick walls and whispered beneath skirts, making every corner of the Flynn house a quiet battle between warmth and winter. Isadora sat by the window of the attic room, her fingers curled around the edge of a blank page. The ink in the well had begun to thicken from the cold, and the nib of the pen scratched faintly with each uncertain stroke. The words refused to form. She had written and rewritten the same opening line no less than 7 times. Dearest Eleanor. She stared at the phrase again, the curve of the D too sharp, the E too soft, the name too far away. She could see her cousin's face in her mind, softer than hers, rounder at the jaw, always smelling faintly of rosewater. Eleanor, who had once shared secrets beneath lace canopies and pink quilts. Eleanor, who had sat beside her at teas and waltzes, whispering the names of every eligible bachelor in the room. Eleanor, who would not understand. Isadora pressed the back of her hand to her lips, not to hide a sob. She had not cried in days, but to still the rising storm in her chest. There was nothing to say, or rather, there was too much. The page tore as she crumpled it, the sound startling in the stillness. Downstairs, she could hear Margaret moving about the kitchen, humming in that same wandering tune she always used when baking. Flour sifted, wood popped in the hearth, and somewhere beyond that, a hammer struck rhythmically on stone, a signal that Thomas was working again. She lowered her forehead to the desk and closed her eyes. That night, after supper, she did not return to the letter. Instead, she pulled the worn volume of Tennyson from the small bookshelf Margaret kept by the fireplace and opened it without thinking. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, barely louder than the flame. She read aloud, not to anyone, but through herself. Words that had once felt like delicate embroidery now struck the air like thread pulled too tight. She read about breakage, about solitude, about patience that was not weakness, but survival. And as the verses rose and fell, she felt the room around her shift, not physically, but emotionally, like something inside it had tilted slightly, just enough to be noticed. When she glanced up, Thomas was sitting by the fire. His arms were crossed loosely over his chest, his head tilted toward the sound of her voice. His eyes, green and unwavering, met hers for the briefest of moments, then flicked back to the flames. He said nothing, but he had been listening. The following evening, she read again, this time an article from the Boston Courier on the recent labor strikes in the North. Her voice carried more confidence now, more bite. She read of factory women who demanded shorter hours, of children who were dying before their 10th birthdays. She read about the rise in coal prices and the men who profited from suffering. Again, Thomas listened. Again, he said nothing. But when she paused to turn the page, she noticed his hands. One was clenched lightly, resting against his thigh. The other twitched faintly with each injustice she named, as if trying to still a pain he'd carried for years. By the third night, it had become routine. She read. He listened. Margaret smiled knowingly, never intruding. One evening, Isadora returned to the attic after reading a passage of Dickinson aloud. She had left her shawl draped over the back of the chair and went to retrieve it when something caught her eye, a scrap of paper tucked beneath her worn copy of Jane Eyre. It was folded in half and bore only one word: trust. Written in careful, painstaking letters, some too wide, some too crooked. The ink blotched slightly at the end, as though the writer had hesitated. She held it in her palm like something sacred. The letters were uneven, hesitant, but they had been written not from obligation nor shame, but from effort, from desire. She turned the word over and over in her mind. Trust. It was a word she had not tasted in months, not since Julian's voice had turned from sweet to sharp, not since her father's eyes had become colder than the marble columns of Beacon Hill, not since the doors of society had slammed shut behind her with the finality of a guillotine. And here it was, scratched into paper with a trembling hand by a man who spoke in silences and carved dignity into everything he touched. Later that week, she awoke in the night to the sound of hushed voices drifting through the floorboards. The attic walls had thinned with the season, letting in sound the way old wood lets in cold. It was Thomas, speaking in Gaelic. His tone was soft, gentle, protective. The cadence of his voice like lullabies folded into fog. Margaret replied in the same tongue, her voice raspier but equally tender. Isadora didn't understand a word, but she understood the emotion. She felt it in the quiet laughter that followed, in the pause between phrases, in the way Margaret's cough interrupted him and how he waited for her to finish before continuing. It was not just language, it was love. The kind that lived in routine, in care, in shared pain and unspoken loyalty. She turned onto her back and stared at the ceiling, blinking up at the beams. He was not who she had been told he was. He was not simple, not a brute, not a silent, dull-witted man raised from the gutter. He was observant, deep, guarded, and perhaps, only perhaps, lonely. The next morning, she folded the scrap of paper he had written on and placed it between the pages of her book, not to hide it, but to preserve it. When she came down to breakfast, Thomas was already gone. Margaret handed her a warm cup of tea and said nothing of the previous night. But as Isadora sat at the table, she found her hands trembling slightly, her heart pacing faster than it should. Not from fear, but from something far more dangerous. Hope. The factory siren shrieked through the narrow alleys like a wounded animal. It was a sound unlike any other, piercing, urgent, and immediate. It echoed against the brick walls of Boston's industrial quarter and cut through the early morning hush like a blade through linen. Isadora froze where she stood at the pump behind the Flynn house, a tin pail in one hand and her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders. Her breath caught, her heart lurched. Something had happened. Moments later, the kitchen door slammed open. Margaret stepped out, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes narrowed against the distant smoke. "That's the second time this week," she muttered, more to herself than to Isadora. But Isadora was already moving. She set the pail down and ran, skirts lifted just enough to keep from tripping, boots splashing through the mud of the narrow path that led to the mill. Her chest burned from the cold, but she did not stop. Not until she reached the wrought iron gates of Hale Textiles, where a small crowd had already gathered, workers mostly, some still in aprons, others with soot-blackened sleeves, all peering toward the loading dock with pale, drawn faces. There, two men were carrying a third between them. The injured worker, barely older than a boy, was clutching his left hand, which bled freely through a torn sleeve. His face was white with shock, his jaw clenched against pain. Thomas walked beside him, a rag pressed against the boy's arm, his own shirt dark with blood not his own. Isadora pushed through the crowd without thinking. "Thomas!" Her voice was sharper than intended. He turned toward her, surprise flashing across his face. He did not stop walking. "He needs a doctor," he said. "I'll fetch one," she replied without pause. But even as she turned to run, a question rose in her like smoke from a fire she had never meant to light. Why had it happened? Why again? By the time she returned with the physician, an older man with a bag full of trembling instruments and a face that smelled of whiskey and resignation, Thomas had helped carry the boy to a bench behind the storeroom. Blood still dripped from the boy's elbow. The wound was deep. The doctor muttered a curse as he unwrapped it, and Isadora had to look away. When she turned back, Thomas was staring at her, his brow furrowed. His shirt clung to his back with sweat. His collar was stained with soot, yet his eyes held something calmer, resolved. "Come," he said quietly. "You should see." He did not wait for her answer. Inside the mill, the air was thick with heat and metal. The machines had been stopped, but the smell of oil and scorched fabric lingered like a memory no one dared name. Isadora followed Thomas through the narrow passage between the looms, her hands tucked close to her sides to avoid brushing against the wheels, the belts, the gears that turned faster than thought and hungered for flesh. They stopped near a frayed cord. A section of the machine had snapped. The safety chain, what little remained, hung limp, useless. Thomas picked up a folded paper from the work table beside the broken loom. Without a word, he handed it to her. She opened it. It was a factory report, stamped, signed, certified, all equipment in satisfactory condition, no mechanical risk present. C. Hale. Her throat closed. "Charles signed this?" Thomas nodded. "He's not a foreman. He has no right." "He's the owner," Thomas replied. "He has every right." She stared at the signature. Familiar, elegant, deceptive. And this was filed last week, the day after the last boy lost 2 fingers. Isadora gripped the paper as though it might crumble. Her father's name had always held weight, on invitations, on dinner menus, on charitable endowments. Now it bore blood, a seal of death hidden behind the script of civility. Her hands trembled. "Why didn't you stop him?" she asked, her voice low, raw. Thomas met her gaze. "Because men like him don't stop. They only burn through people until nothing is left but ash." His voice did not rise. It didn't need to. The truth in it scorched. They left the mill in silence. That evening, the fire in the Flynn hearth crackled louder than usual. The wind outside howled against the eaves, carrying with it the weight of something unspoken. Margaret had retired early, her back aching from the day's baking. Isadora sat by the window, the report still folded tightly in her lap. Thomas entered the room and closed the door behind him. He stood for a moment without moving, then crossed to the fire and leaned against the mantel. "You blame yourself," she said quietly. His jaw tightened. "Of course I do. You didn't sign the report. I didn't burn it either," she turned toward him. "And if you had, then another man would have died in his place." A pause. The fire snapped. "I watched my father die in that mill." The words landed with the weight of stone, dropped into water. Isadora's breath caught. Thomas did not look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the flames. He was caught between the belts. They called it an accident. But the brakes had been rusted through for months. We reported it. No one listened. His voice was hollow, steady, like a confession carved from bone. "I was 16. I tried to pull him free. Got this." He unbuttoned the top of his shirt, revealing the jagged scar that stretched from his collarbone to his shoulder. Steel caught me, nearly bled out before morning. Isadora could not speak. My mother was left with nothing, he continued. No compensation, no letter of apology, just a funeral. Closed casket. He turned toward her now, his face unreadable. Your father paid the priest. She stood slowly, the report still clutched in her hand. I didn't know, she whispered. I never expected you to. She took a step forward, then another, until the report slipped from her fingers and landed softly at his feet. I'm sorry, she said, and then, without planning to, without permission, she wept. Not loud, not broken, but wholly. Quiet sobs that rose from her chest like rain after drought, like a prayer whispered too late. He did not speak, but he crossed the room and stood in front of her. Gently, he reached out and touched her elbow, as though asking if he could draw her closer. She leaned into him. He wrapped his arms around her with no urgency, no pressure, just warmth, just stillness. His hand settled at her back, the other cradling the back of her head. She pressed her face to his chest, and in that moment, just one, she felt something shift. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was recognition. Two people standing in the aftermath of fire and factory smoke, finding in each other the only kind of solace the world could not corrupt. Not yet, not now, and perhaps not ever. The invitation arrived folded with surgical precision, the thick cream envelope sealed with a wax crest that seemed to sneer rather than announce. It was delivered by hand, no footman, no butler, just a breathless boy from the mill who dropped it on the Flynn doorstep with a bowed head and vanished before questions could catch him. Isadora stared at the envelope for a long time before touching it. The seal was unmistakable. Hale. Her father's name, engraved in silver thread, hovered above the carefully inked address. To Mrs. Thomas Flynn, née Hale. The handwriting was not her father's, it was her stepmother's. Elegant, curved and calculated, her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. The contents were as expected, an invitation to the annual Hale Winter Ball, held at the family estate on Beacon Hill, a gathering where lords of business and ladies of fashion clinked glasses over false laughter, while violins drowned the whispers that ruined reputations. The same ball where, only 1 year ago, she had been the center of the room in pearl tulle and diamonds, Charles Hale's only daughter, courted by heirs and envied by debutantes. Now she was an afterthought, a scandal, a warning stitched into blue silk and shame. The insult was sharp in its elegance. The invitation was not extended to Miss Isadora Hale, nor to Mrs. Flynn alone. No. Her father had seen to it that both her ruin and her shackles were named side by side. Mrs. Thomas Flynn, née Hale. She crumpled the invitation in her fist, her throat tightening with rage. That evening she placed it on the kitchen table. Thomas said nothing at first. He read the card once, then again, slowly, carefully. When he finally looked at her, there was no pity in his eyes, only quiet consideration. "You should go," he said. She blinked. "You're joking." He shook his head. "You should go." "And do what? Curtsy? Smile at the women who called me a disgrace? Dance while my father watches from his throne of power and penance?" Thomas sat back, folding his arms. "Go, but don't ask for forgiveness. Take your name back." His voice was steady, low. The firelight caught the edge of his jaw. He looked at her as though he saw something she had not yet dared to glimpse in herself, strength that could not be crushed, only buried. Her heart thudded. "I have no dress," she said, though her voice had lost all resistance. He nodded once, "Then get one." It was not permission, it was encouragement. The next morning, Isadora walked into the second-hand shop near the harbor, a place she would once have crossed the street to avoid. It smelled of cedar and dust, and the woman behind the counter wore spectacles low on her nose and a measuring tape like a crown. "I need a gown," Isadora said, her chin held high. The shopkeeper lifted a brow. "For church? For war. They settled on a bolt of sapphire blue silk hidden behind 2 bolts of faded muslin and a single roll of garnet velvet. The color was deep, regal, and unlike anything she had ever dared to wear before. Not the white of innocence, not the black of mourning, not the pale pastels of submission. Sapphire, bold, certain, unapologetic. The gown took 3 days to finish. 3 nights of fitting by candlelight, of fingers pricked and threads knotted with haste and hope. It cost her nearly all she had saved from her weekly sewing lessons and the small stipend Margaret had insisted on slipping into her apron pocket each month. But it was worth every coin. The night before the ball, she returned home with the gown carefully folded in a box lined with linen. She entered the house silently, avoiding Margaret's questioning gaze, and climbed to the attic, her steps slow with anticipation. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and the room was warm with the scent of pine and beeswax. But it was not the fire that drew her breath to a halt. It was Thomas. He was kneeling on the floor, sleeves rolled, his shirt open at the collar, a piece of chalk in his hand. He was writing, on the wooden floorboard in careful, uneven letters, some too large, some too narrow. He traced her name, Isadora. His brow was furrowed in concentration. The chalk snapped once, and he picked up another piece, continuing where he had left off. His hands were steady, his eyes unwavering. It was not the first time he had practiced. She could see the faded remnants of earlier attempts in the grain of the wood. She did not speak, not at first. She set the box down silently and stepped closer. The floor creaked beneath her. He turned. Their eyes met. Neither moved. She knelt beside him slowly, the folds of her coat pooling around her like shadowed silk. She looked down at the name, her name, written by the man who the world said could not read it. And yet here it was. Each letter an act of reverence, each curve a defiance of expectation. Her fingers brushed the edge of the chalk line. She did not know why she trembled. "I never asked you to learn this," she said. He glanced at her hand, then back at the letters. "I know. Then why?" His voice was quiet, raw. "Because you live here, in this house, in this room, and I wanted to be able to see your name and know it was mine to protect." She turned toward him slowly, her eyes wide, brimming with something unspoken, fragile, and vast. He sat back slightly, as if unsure whether to rise or retreat, but she reached for him. Not abruptly, not out of duty, but with purpose. She placed a hand on his chest, above his heart. It beat beneath her fingers, strong and fast. Her other hand touched his face, and he closed his eyes, as though her touch was something too powerful to witness. Then, without a word, without question, she kissed him. It was not a kiss of fire, nor desperation, nor need. It was a kiss of choice, of return, of recognition. She trembled not from fear, but from the weight of what she felt, for the man who had written her name as though it were a prayer. When she pulled away, his eyes opened slowly. He did not ask what it meant. He did not demand more. He simply watched her with the kind of stillness that only a man who had waited his whole life to be seen could possess. That night, Isadora slept beside the gown, and when she dreamed, she did not dream of disgrace or scandal. She dreamed of chalk on wood, of a name spoken in silence, and of a future that for the first time did not frighten her. The carriages lined up beneath a canopy of frost-laced branches, their lanterns flickering like restless stars against the velvet darkness of a Boston winter's night. The Hale residence stood illuminated in splendor, every window casting golden light onto the snow-covered stone steps. From inside came the swell of strings and the polished laughter of Boston's elite. High society gathered like peacocks in a grand cage, feathers fanned and talons hidden. Isadora stood just beyond the gates, the hem of her sapphire blue gown lifted slightly to avoid the icy slush that stained the cobblestones. The silk whispered against her legs like a secret, and beneath her gloves her fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the storm inside her. Beside her stood Thomas. He wore a dark suit, clean and modest, tailored by a fellow worker who had measured him with reverence and silence. His shirt was crisp, his collar sharp, and though he refused the burden of a tie, his bearing gave him all the dignity of a prince in exile. A single rose, deep crimson, was pinned to his lapel. It had been Margaret's idea. Neither spoke. Not yet. The doors opened, and a butler, stiff with pride, hesitated only slightly before offering a nod of acknowledgement. His eyes flicked between them. He swallowed whatever greeting might have formed and stepped aside. They entered together. The ballroom was a cathedral of glitter and glass, gold-trimmed mirrors stretched between towering windows, chandeliers sparkled above like constellations caught mid-swing, laughter floated over the hush of music and crystal, and then they saw her. Isadora descended the staircase slowly, her hand light on Thomas's arm, her gaze level and unyielding. The sapphire gown shimmered with each movement, the black lace sleeves hugging her arms like a promise. Her hair was swept up in elegant defiance, two loose tendrils framing her face. She wore no necklace, no earrings, no tiara, only the quiet power of a woman unafraid to be seen again. Whispers surged through the room like wind through dry leaves. She came with him. Did you see what she's wearing? She dares. But others, slightly older, slightly wiser, nodded. Some met her eyes. A few even smiled. And then, Isadora! The voice broke through the noise like sunlight parting cloud. Eleanor. The cousin who had once braided her hair by candlelight, the only girl who had ever dared tease Charles Hale. She cut through the crowd in a seafoam green gown and flung her arms around Isadora without hesitation. "My God," she whispered, "you look like justice." Isadora allowed herself the smallest smile. "You came. I live 3 streets over. I was waiting." Their embrace lingered a moment longer before Eleanor turned to Thomas and extended her hand. "And you must be the husband who made a lady out of Boston's finest rebel." Thomas glanced at Isadora. Then, slowly, he took Eleanor's hand. "I didn't make her anything," he said. She already was. The string quartet shifted into a livelier tune, but the ballroom held its breath. Charles Hale appeared. He approached like winter itself, measured, cold, regal. His frock coat was tailored with military precision, and his white cravat gleamed beneath his chin like a blade. He stopped 2 paces away from them, his pale blue eyes taking in the scene with ruthless calculation. "You've made your statement," he said. Isadora did not flinch. "Not yet." He arched a brow. "Whatever pride you think you're reclaiming, Isadora, you've already spent it. That dress won't wash away your shame." Thomas stepped forward then, not a threat, but a presence. "Careful, Mr. Hale," he said quietly. "There are people listening." Charles laughed, dry and low. "Oh yes, and I'm sure the machinists and dockhands hanging on your every word will shape the future of Boston." And then 2 men emerged from the crowd. They were well-dressed, confident. One had a cigar between his teeth. The other sipped champagne as though the world belonged to him. "Well, well," the cigar drawled, "so this is the infamous Mr. Flynn. You wear your collar better than expected." The other chuckled. "Pity no one taught you to use a knife and fork before they handed you a Hale." Thomas's jaw tightened. His hand balled into a fist, hidden behind his coat. Isadora stepped forward. "Enough," she said, her voice calm, sharp as cut glass. "You've insulted the man who now bears your master's shame, and now—" She pulled a folded packet from her velvet clutch. "You'll see why I came." Charles's gaze shifted. "What are you doing?" She unfolded the paper. 1 page, stamped, forged. "This is a safety report from Hale Textiles," she said. Her voice did not rise, but every word rang clear. "Signed by Charles Hale, filed the day after a child lost his fingers to a rusted loom. Equipment listed as functioning. No inspection date, no maintenance record." Murmurs swept the room. "Where did you get that?" Charles asked, low and furious. "From your mill, from your desk," she replied. "But it's already been copied. and already shared. She turned to the journalist. The woman stood near the orchestra, dressed in navy satin, her pen already poised. Miss Stroud of the Boston Sentinel. Shall I speak slower? Miss Stroud smiled. The orchestra stopped. The room did too. Charles's face paled, then flushed. His mouth opened, closed again. He looked around as though expecting someone to come to his rescue, but no one moved, no one interrupted. Isadora turned back to Thomas. His eyes met hers, not with pride, but with something deeper. He reached for her hand, and for the first time in that ballroom, their fingers touched, not in duty but in dignity. She leaned in slightly, her voice for him alone. "I didn't come to hurt him," she said. "I know. I came to tell the truth." He nodded once. "And you did." As the orchestra resumed, as the voices rose again, not in laughter but in awe, Isadora Hale Flynn stood at the center of the ballroom, not as a guest, not as an outcast, but as a woman who had burned through silence and risen in the ashes of her own name. And this time, no one dared look away. The snow had begun to fall again by the time they reached the Flynn house, blanketing the narrow alley in a stillness so absolute it felt sacred. Each flake melted on Isadora's skin like a final whisper of the world she had left behind. Her slippers, so ill-fitted for the walk home, were soaked through, but she did not complain. She had walked away from Beacon Hill with her spine straight, her head held high, and the fire of justice burning in her chest. Her father's name no longer carried weight over her soul. Her own name, restored, reclaimed, rewritten, burned brighter. But even as the warmth of defiance lingered in her blood, the small house on the edge of the Mill District came into view, and something inside her shifted. The golden light from the parlor window, the low curl of smoke from the chimney, the familiar creak of the wooden porch, all of it reminded her that she belonged to another world now. A world not built of chandeliers and expectations, but of effort, of survival, of love in the quietest form. Thomas opened the door first. The fire had burned low, and Margaret Flynn was on the floor. She was lying on her side near the hearth, her shawl twisted beneath her, one hand still clutched loosely around a wooden spoon. A faint sheen of sweat glistened on her forehead, and her breathing was shallow, raspy, unsteady. The kettle beside her had tipped, and a trail of water led across the floorboards like a map of distress. "Mother!" Thomas dropped to his knees, his voice cracking into urgency. Isadora rushed forward, kneeling on the opposite side. Her gloves were off before she could think. She reached for Margaret's pulse with trembling fingers, her heart pounding in her ears. "She's burning," Isadora murmured. "Her skin's on fire." "I'll get Dr. Langley," Thomas said, already rising. "No," Isadora gripped his coat. "Don't go alone. The snow's heavier now, But he was already out the door, his boots thundering across the steps into the storm. Isadora turned back to Margaret, brushing a damp curl from the woman's temple. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Stay here." She lifted Margaret carefully, settling her head on a pillow pulled from the settee. Then she fed the fire with every scrap of wood she could find, watching the light crawl across the woman's face. Margaret stirred. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, unfocused, then closed again. Isadora reached for the kettle, refilled it with fresh water, and returned it to the hook above the flame. Then she soaked a cloth and wrung it out, pressing it gently to Margaret's forehead. "I'm here," she whispered. "You're not alone." The hours stretched thin. Outside, the snow swallowed the night. Inside, Isadora sat on the floor, wiping Margaret's brow, whispering lullabies half-remembered from childhood. Her own body ached from fatigue, but she dared not sleep. She listened for the crackling fire, for Margaret's breathing, for the sound of boots returning through the snow. When Margaret's eyes opened again, they held a clouded softness, fevered but lucid enough to find Isadora's face. "You came back," she rasped. Isadora leaned in. "Yes, I'm here." Margaret's lips trembled. "I knew you would. He needed someone, not to fix him, but to see him. Isadora swallowed the knot rising in her throat. He sees more than anyone. Margaret reached out weakly. Her hand trembled in the air until Isadora clasped it. "You're my daughter," she murmured. The words were fragile, warm, so full of acceptance they broke something deep in Isadora's chest. "Yes," she said softly, "I am." Then the older woman closed her eyes again, her breath slowing but steady. When the doctor finally arrived, trailing snow and urgency, he examined Margaret, prescribed tonics, and left with few words but a grim expression. "She'll live," he muttered, "but slower now. She won't have many winters left." Isadora thanked him, her voice quiet, her soul louder. For 3 days, she stayed at Margaret's side. Thomas moved like a ghost through the house, bringing broth, changing cloths, never speaking more than needed. His silence was not cold, but filled with something heavier than fear. It was guilt. On the 4th morning, the wind had stilled. The sun tried to pierce through the frost-caked windows. Margaret slept peacefully, her chest rising and falling in a gentle rhythm. Isadora came down from the attic and found Thomas by the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug, eyes fixed on the grain of the wood as if reading something she could not see. "You're leaving," she said. He didn't flinch. "Yes." "For how long?" His answer took a moment. "For good." She felt it before she understood it. The quiet devastation. "You think you ruined me." He stood slowly. "Your father disinherited you, your name, your place in that world. It's gone. I walked away from that place long before he closed the door." Thomas stepped toward her, his jaw tense, his voice rough. "I had no right to drag you into this life. You were never meant for soot and torn sleeves. I don't have books or titles or tea sets. I can't give you anything." She looked at him, not as a wife desperate to be chosen, but as a woman who had already chosen. "You gave me something no one else ever did." He frowned. "You gave me truth." His throat worked. "Isadora, you were never the shame," she said. "You were the answer." And then she closed the distance between them. Her hands reached for his, rough and warm, the hands that had saved, built, protected. She placed them gently on her waist, her gaze never breaking from his. "I don't want finery," she said. "I want this. I want the man who writes my name in chalk and holds me when I break. The man who doesn't flinch when I speak and doesn't run from my past." She brought her hand to his cheek, feeling the way his breath trembled beneath her fingers. "Don't leave me," she whispered. He looked at her as though he had never seen color before. And then he kissed her. It was not hurried, not desperate. It was quiet, earned, reverent. The kind of kiss that did not take, but gave. The kind that spoke of nights spent beside sickbeds and words traced in candlelight. The kind that began not with fire, but with recognition. They stood there for a long time, the room still, the house breathing softly around them. That night, they lay together, not out of passion nor pity, but from the simple, undeniable truth of belonging. When sleep finally claimed them, it was with hands still intertwined, and outside the snow fell again. But this time, it did not silence the world. It only softened it. The frost lingered longer now. The sun, pale and late, filtered through the grey Boston sky as though asking permission to rise. Mornings arrived with breath visible in the air and hands wrapped tightly around hot mugs, the city preparing for yet another season of survival. But within a modest brick house tucked near the edge of the Mill District, something had begun to change, not in weather, but in purpose. Inside that home, Isadora moved with quiet determination. The parlor, once reserved for silence and stitching, had been transformed. A long wooden table now sat by the window, its surface worn but polished. Stacks of books, some borrowed, some donated, many mended by her own hands, lined the walls in careful rows. A small iron stove kept the room warm, and beside it, 2 woven baskets brimmed with folded shawls and leftover biscuits for those who came in need of both learning and comfort. The neighborhood children called it the reading room, though it bore no sign, no plaque, no title. To Isadora, it was more than a space. It was a quiet rebellion. Each morning, after the looms had begun their endless clatter and the factory whistles had faded into distance, women would arrive in twos and threes, some with children on their hips, some still wearing soot-streaked aprons, some older, their hands calloused and their eyes guarded. They sat around the table with books open before them, tracing letters as though each one might unlock a secret the world had kept from them. Isadora guided them patiently. She taught them not just to read, but to see themselves in the words, one letter at a time. Outside, Thomas had begun work on something far more ambitious. Behind the church, where the grass had long given way to ash and gravel, he laid out the foundation for a schoolhouse. There had been no announcement, no ceremony, only hammers and sweat and the rhythm of labor passed down through generations of men who never needed blueprints to build something honest. The children watched him work from the edge of the path, their fingers pressed to the wrought iron fence, whispering as the walls began to rise. "Mr. Flynn's building a school. My ma says he used to fix looms, now he builds futures. Is he a teacher now?" Thomas never answered those questions. He worked with his head down, the muscles in his arms taut beneath his sleeves, his boots planted deep in the earth. But when Isadora brought him tea near dusk, he always paused, just long enough to take the cup and meet her gaze with a look that spoke more than words ever could. In the evenings, they sat by the fire in the parlor, Margaret resting quietly in her rocking chair, her shawl drawn high around her shoulders. She no longer bustled about the kitchen or hummed at dawn. Her hands shook more often than not, and her voice had grown softer, thinner, but her eyes still held warmth. And when she looked at Isadora, there was no distinction between daughter and stranger, only love. Thomas had started writing at night, not always, not consistently, but often enough that Isadora noticed the smudge of chalk beneath his fingernails and the faint scrape of wood being sanded behind the house. One evening, after Margaret had gone to bed and the fire had burned low, Isadora stepped outside to gather kindling. The wind nipped at her cheeks, and her breath rose in clouds as she rounded the back corner of the house. She stopped. Along the outer wall, leaning upright in neat rows, stood dozens of wooden panels. Each one had a single word etched into its surface. The letters were careful, though not perfect, some deep, others faint, but everyone carved with steady hands. Bread, fire, table, window, quilt, lamp, voice, courage, roof, begin. She ran her fingers over the grooves, her throat tightening. Each word was something essential, something built. She moved slowly, stepping between the panels, her breath catching at each new discovery. Hope, shelter, trust, learn, mother, strength. Her eyes burned. She blinked. Then she saw the final board. It stood slightly apart from the others, its edges sanded smooth, a ribbon of cotton tied around the corner, like a gift too fragile to be opened. And on it, carved with precision, with reverence, was her name, Isadora. She pressed a hand to her mouth, the tears falling before she could stop them. Her knees buckled, but she did not fall. She leaned against the wood, trembling, as though the board itself carried the weight of every moment they had shared, every silence, every look, every brush of a hand that had meant far more than words ever could. He had not given her poetry. He had given her permanence. Behind her, she heard the soft crunch of boots on frost-hardened earth. She did not turn. Thomas's voice, low and tender, reached her like the warmth of fire through wool. "I started with things I needed to survive." She nodded, unable to speak. "And then, things I wanted you to have." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, she turned. He stood beneath the faint halo of the porch lantern, his arms folded, the shadows catching the tired lines of his face. But in his eyes, green, steadfast, there was no hesitation, only certainty. "I didn't think I'd get past bread and fire," he said. "But then, you kept teaching me." Her voice came out cracked. "You were never the student." He stepped closer, closing the space between them, though he did not touch her. She reached for him first. Her hand settled on his chest, above his heart, and he drew in a breath as if it were the only one that mattered. "I've spent my life trying to be seen," she whispered. "You didn't just see me, Thomas. You built a place where I could see myself." He looked down at her hand. Then, without a word, he lifted hers and kissed the palm, gently, reverently, before pressing it to his cheek. That night, they did not speak of the school or the reading room or the neighbors, who now nodded to them with respect instead of pity. They did not speak of her father or the name she had lost. They simply returned to the parlor. Margaret slept by the fire, her breath slow and steady. Thomas and Isadora curled together on the settee, her head resting on his shoulder, his fingers tracing the edge of her sleeve. The room held a quiet so complete it felt like prayer, not to be found, not to be forgiven, but simply to be. Outside, the wind carried the scent of pine and the promise of snow. The world continued, loud and merciless. But in that moment, in that room built of lace and labor, they were not lost. They were finally found. 1 year had passed. Boston, ever restless, had changed its rhythm with the seasons, but in the mill quarter, time had begun to shape itself around something gentler. The clang of metal still echoed in the early hours. Children still darted across cobbled streets like laughter in motion, but between the red brick chimneys and soot-stained walls, there now stood something no one expected. A schoolhouse, built by hand, beam by beam, painted in white with forest green shutters, modest in size, but proud in its lines, like the man who had raised it from the frozen ground with little more than sweat and patience. Its windows caught the light each morning, and its door never once closed on a child in need of warmth or words. And within it, most days, was Isadora. She no longer wore silks, not even in memory. Her dresses were practical now, wool or cotton, stitched by her own hands, ink-stained at the cuffs, but her posture still carried the elegance of a woman who had once been introduced with titles and fanfare. She did not erase her past. She simply rewrote it. She taught reading to children by day and led evening gatherings for workers who had begun to understand that knowledge was not just survival, it was power. She no longer stood behind her name. She stood in it, spoke through it. Mrs. Flynn, they called her now. The women who gathered in her reading room no longer averted their eyes. They brought loaves of bread and hand-me-down coats for the children. They stayed late to ask questions. They wept when she read them lines of poetry that named the ache in their hearts. One of the young mothers, Esther, once whispered, "You make words feel like a doorway." Isadora had smiled softly and replied, "That's all they ever were." Outside the house, Margaret Flynn rocked gently on the front porch. Her hair had silvered completely now, tucked beneath a woolen cap. She wore the shawl Isadora had crocheted for her last winter, a warm thing in a deep plum color, uneven in its weave, perfect in its affection. Her joints no longer allowed for baking or sweeping, but her eyes missed nothing. She watched the neighborhood children run. She watched the world tilt towards spring. She watched her son build a life from nothing but honesty. And she watched Isadora love him without fear. Charles Hale, disgraced and forgotten, had vanished from Boston. Some whispered he'd gone to London to recover his fortune. Others claimed he lived alone in a seaside town, staring out to the ocean as if it might give him back his pride. No headlines followed him. No letters came. His name, once printed in gold on invitations, now lingered only as a cautionary echo in rooms where justice had found a voice. No one missed him. One late afternoon, as orange leaves drifted across the porch, and the town prepared for the annual harvest dance, Isadora stood before the mirror in the bedroom she shared with Thomas. Her fingers worked quickly, braiding her hair into a soft crown. Her gown, a deep marigold hue with embroidered cuffs, clung gently to her frame. A dress of warmth and dignity, not expensive, not loud, but unforgettable. The sun dipped lower as she pinned a brooch to her collar, a delicate silver oval with no stone. Inside, it was the only photograph she owned of her mother, worn at the edges but kept near her heart. Downstairs, Thomas adjusted his cuffs with fingers rough from labor, now made precise by habit. His dark suit fit cleanly across his shoulders, tailored by the same man who had once repaired boots for factory hands. He looked into the mirror and saw not a mill worker or an orphan boy, but a man unafraid to be loved. In his pocket was a folded slip of paper, a name, written in perfect script. The school children had helped him write it over the past 3 months. 1 letter each week. He had practiced by candlelight, carved it into old wood, whispered it beneath his breath when he walked past the chapel. Isadora. He did not need to give it to her. He only needed to carry it. That night, the town square was lit with paper lanterns in shades of amber and rose. Music floated into the cool night air, and the scent of cinnamon and roasted apples wove between laughter and fiddle strings. Couples danced barefoot on the wooden platform. Children twirled in their father's arms. And above it all, a sense of belonging wrapped around the gathering like an old quilt brought down from the attic. Isadora arrived just as the music paused. Conversations quieted as heads turned. She did not walk in with a flourish. She did not arrive escorted by legacy or wealth. She stepped onto the dance floor beside Thomas with the calm of someone who no longer had anything to prove, only something to share. A new song began. He took her hand. They danced slowly, gracefully, her fingers woven between his, her gaze never leaving his face. There was no choreography, only rhythm born of days spent building a life side by side. His hand on her waist was warm, her body fit into his, as though the years had been leading them to this moment all along. Around them the townspeople applauded, not out of politeness, but reverence, for what they had built, for who they had become, not a scandal, not a cautionary tale, not a ruined daughter and the man she had been sentenced to, but a love earned, tended, and true. Margaret clapped softly from the edge of the square, her eyes shining with quiet joy. The children giggled and whispered, "That's their teacher, and that's Mr. Flynn." Isadora leaned her head on Thomas's shoulder. "I never thought," she whispered, "that ashes could carry lace." He smiled against her hair. "You made lace out of fire." The song ended, but they did not stop dancing, because now no one could take their place away. Not scandal, not silence, not time. They had stitched their story by hand, thread by thread, word by word. And that night, beneath the lanterns and the sky that had once felt too far, their love lit everything it touched. Autumn again. The air in Boston had the crispness of fading leaves and old memories. Brick chimneys puffed white smoke into the sky, and the distant clang of trolleys echoed through narrower streets that now bustled with new life. But on the edge of town, just beyond the old mill road, stood a house with ivy climbing its stones and a porch bathed in golden light. It was quiet there, not silent, never silent, but filled with the gentle sounds of a life that had learned to breathe slowly, without fear. The schoolhouse stood taller now, freshly painted every other year by volunteers. A second building had been added just last spring, a place for sewing lessons, led by the very same women who had once been students in the reading room. Their fingers, once stiff from factory labor, now stitched futures in every hem. Isadora walked through the front gate, a wicker basket in one arm, her skirt brushing the tops of the turning leaves. Her hair, still dark with only the faintest silver at her temples, was braided and pinned, wisps escaping in the breeze. There were lines now near her eyes, lines that deepened when she smiled, which was often. She waved to the children at recess, who shouted her name with affection. "Mrs. Flynn, look at my letters. Mrs. Flynn, I drew your house." 8 years had passed since the harvest dance. 8 years since the town stopped whispering and started witnessing. Isadora placed the basket on the table inside the reading room and glanced to the wall, where a single photograph hung in a carved wooden frame. It showed a gathering of the town's first women petitioners, arms linked, smiling despite the cold. In the center stood Isadora, younger and weary-eyed, but radiant with the kind of joy no society column ever captured. Her gaze drifted to the far end of the room. There, beside a window trimmed with lace curtains, sat a boy no older than 6. Bent over a slate, tongue between his teeth, dark curls falling into his eyes. He concentrated fiercely on each stroke of chalk, mumbling each letter aloud. T-H-O. A shadow crossed the doorway. Thomas leaned against the frame, sleeves rolled, collar slightly askew, as always. He hadn't changed much, broader in the shoulders perhaps, a few more silver threads in his beard, but his eyes were the same. Green, steady, and endlessly aware of her. He watched their son with quiet awe. The boy looked up. "Is this how you spell home, Papa?" Thomas crossed the room, knelt beside him and touched the slate. "Yes," he murmured. "That's exactly how." Isadora leaned against the wall, her heart aching with the sweetness of the moment. They had not planned on children. The world had never made room for plans. But when their son arrived after a difficult labor in the thick of winter, he had brought with him something beyond comprehension. Not hope, not joy, but proof. That love did not erase the past. It redeemed it. They named him Ewan, after Thomas's father, whose name had once been whispered only in grief. Now it was spoken daily, with laughter, correction, lullabies. Margaret Flynn had lived long enough to hold him. She'd whispered, "You've returned to us," in Gaelic, then closed her eyes one last time with his hand in hers. Her shawl now lay folded in the rocker, untouched but never forgotten. As for Charles Hale, his fate was not romantic. There had been no deathbed apology, no redemptive return. A letter arrived once, unsigned, sharp-edged, filled with veiled reproach. Isadora burned it unread, but she bore no bitterness. She had built too much to make space for ghosts. Outside, a bell rang. The children gathered their books, laughter swirling like wind through the branches. Isadora stepped onto the porch and watched them scatter down the path, their futures unwritten but no longer shackled. Thomas joined her, his hand sliding into hers without need for words. "Do you remember," he asked, voice soft, "when you couldn't boil water?" She laughed, low and warm. "And you couldn't read window." "I remember," he said, smiling, "how you looked the first night you read aloud. You didn't know I was listening." "I knew," she whispered, eyes shining. "I always knew." The sun dipped lower. Evening crept in, slow and amber-colored. Behind the house, in the workshop Thomas had expanded with lumber and patience. Dozens of panels hung on the wall, not of vocabulary now, but of phrases their son had written, traced, etched. "My mother reads like music. My father builds what he loves." And in the center, in a child's hand, "We are not rich, but we are full." The lace curtain fluttered. The ashes of the past had long since cooled, but the lace, that delicate weave of sorrow and strength, of pain and promise, remained. It held them still, and always would. Some stories begin with grandeur, others with a fall. Isadora's began with shame, silence, and a forced vow. But where others saw ruin, she stitched something far more enduring: dignity, resilience, and a love that was never loud, but always true. Through the cold of judgment and the smoke of factory gates, she found not only her own voice, but helped others find theirs. Thomas, once dismissed for what he could not read, became a man who taught by example, building not just a schoolhouse, but a legacy of trust and gentleness. This is not just a tale of romance, it's a reminder that what begins in ashes can rise. That lace, as fragile as it seems, is stronger than it looks. And that sometimes the life we never chose is the one that sets us free. If this story moved you, even just one quiet moment or one tender glance, we'd love to know. Leave us a comment below sharing your thoughts. And if you made it to the very end, write the word lace in the comments. That one word tells us you felt the heart of this journey and helps us know who stayed with Isadora and Thomas until the final lantern faded. If you wish to support the creators who bring these stories to life, consider leaving a super thanks here on YouTube. Whether it's a symbolic amount or something more, every contribution helps keep the ink flowing, the candles lit, and these tales reaching hearts like yours. And if supporting financially isn't possible right now, don't worry. Sharing this video with someone who loves dramatic emotional period romances is a beautiful way to help. Truly, every share is a ripple that carries our stories farther. Looking for more stories like this one? Check out the other heartfelt period dramas we've left for you in the cards above. They're waiting to be discovered, just like Isadora was. Thank you, from our hearts to yours, for walking through ashes and lace with us.